the final thing I did was set him down in my mind in a chair. And I just went through all the stuff and told him how I felt, even though he wasn't sitting there, because I didn't want him to have any more territory in my life. And what that was a beginning.
Before we start today's episode, I would like you to know that this episode does include content about domestic violence. While we have been very careful about how we have addressed it in this interview, just know that we will be discussing domestic violence, but with that, we will also be discussing the hope and the help that comes with the star of the story, which is Jesus. So with that being said, let's drop into this episode on forgiving domestic violence. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. I'm so excited. We are in the second episode of season 4, Forgiving Trauma Makers. It is October of 2022, and I am honored today to be sitting with a fellow survivor who we are going to discuss today, forgiving trauma makers. And in our case, both of our cases, our trauma makers were people that we stood in front of God and our friends and vowed to love forever in sickness and in health, and in death, and in life, and in richness, and being poor, and all the things. But one thing that we didn't sign up for was being abused. And so I am here today with my friend, Karen DeArmond Gardner. Welcome, Karen, to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I've been anticipating this for more than a year.
I am so excited. Yes, we talked about it last October, and just like every other interview that I do, because my life is incredibly complicated, we've had to reschedule this a couple times. So I'm so grateful that you are here. But we are here, Karen, to just go for the jugular. We are in a season on the Wednesdays with Watson podcast where we are talking about how do we forgive trauma makers? How do we obey Ephesians 4:32, which I've often been quoted as saying is not a suggestion, it is a command. Ephesians 4:32, be kind one to another, tenderhearted, compassionate, forgiving one another, even as Christ has forgiven you. And so for listeners, you know, if this is the first episode that you're picking up in season 4, that is our core verse, as we do believe that it is a command, but we also know that it is not an easy one. And we also know that we live in a broken and a fallen world. And Karen, I'm always really nervous about saying those words on my podcast because not everyone who listens to my podcast believes in Jesus, the star of the story. Many of them blame him for what has happened to them. But I don't know any other way through without just believing in Jesus, the star of the story. And so the first thing I would love to do, and we're asking this to everyone in season 4, before we get into your story, because forgiveness means something different to all of us in some ways, right? And so if you were to articulate, like just say somebody that you're mentoring or any given situation where somebody would just randomly ask you, Karen, can you tell me what forgiveness means to you? Can you share with my listeners before we begin to share your story what forgiveness means to you?
Forgiveness at one time was more like a cuss word, but it became the hardest, most difficult, most beautiful thing that I've done. It's the ability, it's releasing somebody who harmed me, while they go on their merry way, as if they had no issue with it, like the problem wasn't them. And then I had to live with the consequences of what they did. And the hardness of releasing, not having, because it is a choice, of releasing them from what they did to me and not carrying the weight of that around for the rest of my life.
Yeah. So release. So I'm hearing you say release, and we had a conversation pre-interview, and I think that this is really important to point out again before we get to your story, because one of the things you said to me, and this is something that I have said over and over and over again, and I even shared this story with you, and I've shared it before on my podcast, is that I remember in the throes of my own domestic violence story, laying in bed at night waiting for what was coming for me, and I had gotten out of church and really had no active relationship with Jesus. But I remember laying in bed that night, knowing what was coming for me, literally listening to it coming for me, him coming, footsteps, all the things. And I remember thinking, Lord, surely this is the 491st time. And what I'm referring to, of course, is that scripture where I believe it's Peter who said to Jesus, how many times are we to forgive? And Jesus, said, well, you're to forgive 70 times 7. And so I know, so I just want to start the interviews. I know there are people out there, Karen, who are listening, who, whether it's domestic violence or something else, they're saying, but you don't know the pain. You don't know. And they're right. We don't. And so that is our attempt here today, is for both of us to share some of our pain and then our journey into how you released it. And back to that point, you and I talked about, when I told you that story about, surely this is the 491st time, how even today, and I don't know about you, but I am about 15 years separated from leaving him. Even today, there are times when I have to forgive him again. Do you find that to be true as well?
Yeah, just last week.
Yeah, just last week, right. And so listeners out there, forgiveness seems like a daunting task, but it's not a one and done. You have the opportunity to, because of what was done for you, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, to forgive over and over and over. Well, Karen, with that being said, I want you to share what you're comfortable with our listeners, fully understanding that most of the people that listen to this podcast are trauma survivors. Quite a few of them are domestic violence survivors. We gave the little warning and an air quote when I say that at the beginning, and I know you'll be respectful because you've written a book of those who will listen. But I would love to know, first of all, a couple things, because I want to build the story for the listeners. Did you grow up in church?
I didn't start going till I was 15.
Okay. And I believe we are of the similar age, Gen Xers. And if you were in church at that time, and she's like,
I'm going to say thank you, but I'm not a Gen Xer.
oh, you are not a baby boomer. There's no way.
I am a baby boomer.
Are you really? Wow. No, yeah, that's fantastic. Wow.
I am a baby boomer. Yes.
You have to be at the end of the baby boomer. Well, that actually is going to make my point a little bit stronger, to be honest with you. Because as the generations, of course, have gone on, particularly in church, right? I started going to church when I was about 10. There were a couple messages that were on rent and repeat, right? One of those messages was about salvation, which I'm really, really grateful for. But of course, they use fear tactics and all the things. The other thing was, of course, sexual purity. And we've talked about that on this podcast and how that can turn into shame. But the third thing that had been advocated to us at that time in church was that God hates divorce, right? And so I don't know about you, and I'm going to ask you this after you tell us your story, but that's one of the reasons why I stayed, because of that faulty theology. And so I wanted the listeners to know whether or not you received that theology, and when you got married, before we start your story, when you got married, was that your thought process, that God hates divorce, and if I get divorced, he's going to hate me?
I don't know that I thought about it from the beginning. It was probably later as an adult of reading the scriptures and hearing that. And I don't remember specific messages, but it just was something that was driven home. Marriage is for life. You don't get a divorce. My mom was a single mom. She got a divorce from my father when I was 9. It actually started when I was 8. It ended when I was 9 because it took a year for a divorce to be final in the 60s. And so when we started going to church, what I didn't know, I learned later, is that she was somewhat ostracized in our Baptist church because she was divorced and remarried. And her current husband was an alcoholic. And so, but in that environment, she came to Jesus.
Wow.
And impacted our lives because my siblings and I, we all came to Jesus within 3 years. It turns out my brother actually came to Jesus before we even started going to that church. So she impacted our life. She made the decision, and she kept going to church. She kept volunteering, even though they saw her as something wrong with her because she was a divorced woman.
Wow. And I really hope that that's not the case anymore. Although I had someone say it to me about a year ago. I was dating somebody and they actually sent me a message and said, "You know, you can't get married, right, to that person." And my ex-husband's actually also deceased, and so we could argue that I'm a widow and a divorcee. But yeah, that message was really driven home, and there are scriptures that talks about how God hates divorce, but not in this context of abuse, right? So
Right.
let's talk about your story. Where did you meet your now ex-husband?
Well, after I graduated from high school, I went off to a Bible college in Michigan. I grew up in Southern California. And so when I came back home for the summer, I was going to be heading off to Chicago to work at, I don't want to say a missionary, but to work in Chicago at a mission that was geared towards Jewish people. That we wanted to, that's where the mission mind, it's where my heart was, were for Jewish people to know their Messiah. And so a friend of mine introduced us, and we started dating, and we got married within 2.5 months. I know, like, just that's wrong, but I was young. Even though I dated in high school, I didn't really date a lot, and this was the first guy who was enthralled with me, who treated me like I was special, who listened to everything I had to say. And I realized, not, well, just a couple years ago, I realized I revealed one of my deepest, darkest secrets to him that I had not revealed to anybody prior to
Mm.
that. And so he was engaging, he was kind, he was in the Marine Corps, my father was in the Marine Corps. So I grew up in that environment. And he, like I said, charismatic, fun loving. He was the life of the party. He was musical. In high school, he was the prep boy, which was not the kind of guy that I usually hung around with. And he just was an all-around good guy, and it seemed, but there was this darkness that was underneath. And it's been one of the hardest things to in all my healing of looking back on that time of dating, and how I missed the red flags, ignored the red flags, didn't even realize there were giant waving red flags. um, but they're really good at disguising that. And you didn't know to look for it on top of that. and because I hadn't really ever been in a relationship, you didn't know. And it's one of the things that was really hard to heal from. And even now, I still do not like looking back at that time. And
Can you share with us before we continue with
mhm.
your story? Because I don't know that I just really kind of received this in my spirit from the Lord that somebody needs to know what some of those red flags are. Could you share with us, say like three to
Yeah,
five of red flags that you saw, or
well,
that I should say looking back now. You
right,
see,
looking
yeah,
back, yeah, it is looking back. One, he's so attentive to you and listening. That's a good quality. We're all told to be good listeners. What I didn't know is he was learning boundaries and secrets and non-negotiables, but it was also pushing boundaries, because then he started pushing boundaries. So pushing boundaries, and how they talk to you. It's we're taught, in leadership is taught, if you need to tell someone hard, you tell them something good, then you tell them the hard, and then you wrap it in something positive that they did. Abusers use that same tactic, and they'll give you something nice here, but then it's all wrapped in a dig. It's derogatory and it's demeaning, but you don't notice it because it starts and ends with something good. And if you don't sit back and pay attention to what they say, then you miss it, or you dismiss it because you're thinking, oh, they were just joking.
yeah.
And there's a proverb about, oh, they're just joking, but it's like an arrow in the heart. Then there's also just um, the rush, the push, um, keeping you busy, not giving you time to breathe, wanting to talk all the time, wanting to spend all their time with you, and dropping hints about other people. And so it sounds like pushing them away, like there's
Yeah.
something wrong with the people that are closest to
Right.
you.
They're isolating you, right?
The
From
isolating.
your friends and family. Yeah.
Right, right. And my family loved him. My brother and his then girlfriend and my sister and her then boyfriend, the six of us would do things together and everybody liked him because he was the life of the party. But what we didn't know, what we couldn't see was that darkness that was hidden inside of him that didn't come out until after the I do's were said.
Right.
And then that was like, and then it was slowly. Now, some guys, they'll come off hard and fast immediately. Others will come slowly and they don't do it all at once. So they don't want to scare you off. Um,
Yeah, they're very, very calculated in their behaviors, right? It's a little bit, at least for me, and I wonder if this is true for you, it's a little bit like that analogy, and I will use the full analogy for those in Generation Z that listen to this podcast that will not know what I'm talking about, but the frog in the water, right? So you put a frog in cold water, and he's happy as he can be. He's just chilling in the water, and then you and then you turn up some heat a little bit, and he's still just chilling in the water, and then finally, slowly, you're turning up the heat, and the frog is not noticing because the changes are so incremental, so small, and suddenly he's dead, right? And
right.
those were my red flags. I'll add one more here, and I wonder if this was true for you too. Is when John and I were dating, I would see him disrespect his mom. Now, they were verbal disrespects. They were not physical, obviously, but he would disrespect his mom. And I don't know if that is an accurate depiction of something that all people who are dating should be looking for. But how are they treating the other women in their lives? Did you find that to be true?
Well, here's a sad thing because he was in California, he was from another state, and so I didn't meet his family until after we got married. They did not come from for the wedding, and that should have been a huge clue. Um, but then it's, and he actually was fairly respectful to his mom, but it was the rest of the family because there were four of them, and all of them were abusive, and he was the baby of the family. But the only one who wasn't like the others, he came to Jesus later in life, and he really turned his life around. And he was mostly like would be one that was closed off more than anything. But the older two were like huge red flags, and I honestly had no idea what
Well,
I
you're
had
so
gotten myself
young.
into.
So young. And this is, guys, this is a good place for me to put in here. We have some C's on this community. We call them the 3 C's, and I want to add a fourth one day. But counseling, community, church, right? And so for me, because I was so isolated, because he did a great job of isolating me from my friends and from my family, there was no community speaking into my life that said, "Hey, Amy, something's not up here." And because I was so in love, and like you know, hadn't dated a lot in high school or college. I grew up in a children's home, so I certainly didn't date in high school. Worked my way through college, didn't have time. And so my ex-husband was kind of my first foray into dating, into all the things. And I didn't have a great self-image. I thought I was ugly. I didn't think anybody would ever want to marry me. Why would they want to marry somebody so broken, who had been so broken and so abused as a child? And I hated what I looked at in the mirror, so I never thought that I would get married. And so when he came along, what he said went, right? And so when he isolated me from my friends, I didn't care, because suddenly I was going to have a family. I was going to get married, and somebody loved me. And I remember being at work because I finally told him if he didn't ask me to marry him, I was done. And I remember being at work just thinking about him asking me to marry him. And I was so young and so wide-eyed, and I shouldn't have been with all the trauma that I had, right? But those flags could have been the size of the state of Florida, and I may not have seen them. However, had I indoctrinated myself with my community, and as a matter of fact, it was my community is the reason why I ultimately left. And so I just wanted to weave that in here, as I try to do with all of the podcast. And so you get married, and after a very short courtship, and I have a feeling that has something to do with said purity culture. And again, I'm not knocking purity culture. I do believe that we are to abstain until we get married. But I do think, and our generations, our age, you got to be a very late baby boomer, but I think at our age, that was so pounded into us. And as a matter of fact, in those days, if you got pregnant outside of marriage, you got married no matter what. The dude could have been beating you on the daily, but the church said you get married if you get pregnant out of wedlock. And so, moving on with your story, so you get married. What do you begin to notice first in the vein of abuse?
Yeah, it was so slow, but suddenly he didn't want to be around me, and we stayed in California for a few months. So we got married in August, and then we left and moved to where he lived in like January, February the following year. So in between that time, it just all of a sudden, like I don't remember all the things. I just remember the feeling. And I even tried to call my best friend from college, but I still remember shaking so bad I couldn't because I was so confused about what was going on. It never occurred to me to talk to my family, which is who I should have talked to, because I was still around them. I was still in the same town, but just never occurred to me. And so I didn't know if I was just this was marriage. I didn't know what to think. I was 20, about to turn 21, and even though my father was abusive, I did not remember that. I didn't know what the dynamics looked like because I have no memories of his abuse towards my mom. But it was like the whole atmosphere changed. It was like he didn't even like me anymore. And when I think about it, I haven't thought about that year or that 6 months for a long time. And suddenly he didn't like my family. And so I see now the moving back to where his family was, it really sealed the isolation because I was 1,500 miles from my family. And, um, and so then I think the first time I was going to go home and visit my family, he actually punished me. I can't remember if it was either before or after, because that's usually what it came.
Yeah.
It was either before I would go or after I would come back. There was always some form of punishment for um, for I don't know what, you know. It's how do you delve into the mind of an abuser and what they're thinking?
Right.
Because it makes no sense. It's
Right.
illogical.
It's so about control, right?
Right.
Yeah, and it's so about you know, yeah, it's a narcissistic behavior situation, and so mine did not. Well, it kind of started slow, but very similarly, anytime that you take away their illusion of control by introducing anything into it, whether it's a job or a friend or family or church, I often paid the price. Got punished when I went to church. I would go to church and come home, and he had been drinking the night before, and was not appreciative that I got up and went to church and would pay for it. And so, did you pay for it through physical abuse with him?
Um, Sometimes yes. Sometimes it was physical. It was more of coercion and the control and manipulation and the verbal and emotional. The physical wasn't as often, or um, because it was purposeful.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to just sound strange, but he could not do physical harm unless he got me to react.
Yes.
So we know reactive abuse is they pick at you and drive at you and keep going and going and going until you react in a way, and then it gives them an excuse to then do physical harm or silent treatment or keep you up for nights, sleep deprivation, all of those things. It gives them an excuse to do everything.
Yeah.
And I did not remember that until probably within the last year, believe it or not. And I have been out, I'm coming up on the 18th anniversary. I left the day after Christmas of 2004. And So I just celebrated, I'm going to say celebrated, the 17th anniversary of my divorce.
I call it a
And yes,
divorcery. It's a
yeah,
divorcery.
yes. And so it's been a long time, but it was just last year the Lord reminded me that I told him I would never let a man hit me.
Mm,
And so guess what? The first time he assaulted me, he did not hit me. He kicked me. And I did not remember that. And it's like the Lord just dropped that in my head. And I was like, so people say, oh, well, I wouldn't put up with that for 5 minutes. I said that too. We all said that because nobody sets out to get into an abusive marriage. And they're not drawn to us because we're broken, because even in your brokenness, there was a strength about you that you survived, that you came out the other side, and that attracts these guys. Because what's the challenge in breaking someone who's already broken? There's
wow.
no challenge. It's in the strength. It's in what we carry because we have survived hard things. And then if they're Christian, use the word loosely here, then they're attracted to turning the other cheek and forgiveness and marriage for life,
Yeah.
submission, and that man is over woman and you do what he says. And I absolutely took the word obey out of my marriage vows.
I did
I
too.
never
Yeah, I
said
didn't.
I
I know.
would.
Yeah, me either.
I'm like, I am not doing traditional vows because I'm not saying that I'm obeying him. And I find that funny now because I ended up doing that because that conditioning that happens over time
Yeah.
to where the things that I liked became less about what I liked and more what he liked. I mean, so much so that I like my steak medium. He liked his well done. And somewhere along the line, I started ordering my steaks well done.
Wow.
And I'm like, what was I thinking? But it's so sometimes that conditioning, it just comes and it comes, and you don't even know that you're giving up more of who you are. But it's like a vampire, they're sucking everything out of you, everything
Yeah.
good, everything that they don't have, they pull out of you, your goodness, your kindness, your strength, and we make them look good. People
Yeah.
assume they're a nice guy because we're nice people,
Right. Right.
because we're kind and considerate. And so people automatically assume that they're that way too.
I want to let that breathe for the listeners and for me because my mind is blown for a second here. Because I always assumed that because it's funny because I'm in graduate school right now, and before I got on this interview, I was working on a project where I have to compare a situation with causation of disease, right? So, but if we were doing that with this, it would be what is a deep dive study into women who have had traumatic childhoods or witnessed adverse childhood experiences. Domestic violence is a huge one. It is one that kind of gets double points when you go to the doctors, right? What is the percentage of survivors and victims of domestic violence who grew up in it, right? And you said something that I want to address because there are people out there who live in their own little bubble who will be listening to this who don't understand domestic violence. And those are the same people who ask, why did you stay? Why didn't you tell anybody? Why did you go back? Because we know that on average, a domestic violence victim / survivor goes back 7 times. I did not do that. I just waited until it got really bad and then I left. But I want to hone in on that point for a second because they recognize our resilience. They recognize our strength. They recognize our ability to make something out of nothing. And that is the definition of a child, someone who has survived childhood trauma, which I spent an entire season talking about. And so when I think back to my own husband, I can see that now. And as a matter of fact, Karen, it was that resiliency that I learned in childhood that turned us into millionaires. We opened a business, and because I don't, my stop button usually involves a doctor's order. And so that resiliency that came from that trauma as a childhood that clearly he recognized and that he wanted something of, made us millionaires. And so I want listeners out there, those of you who have been through abuse, who may feel like I'm weak and everybody comes and preys on me, to listen to Karen. I think that is really deep, is that whether it's domestic violence or any sort of other kind of abuse, they see us as a resource for them, right? And they're why do they want to pick on a weak person? They can't take anything from a weak person. If they conquer, listen, John Watson conquered a very stubborn Amy. He definitely won that battle, because I'm stubborn. I don't quit. I stayed with him for 12 years. The other thing I wanted to address really quickly is you mentioned that a lot of the abuse was coercion, was verbal, was isolation, all of those things. I maintain to this day that I would have rathered him always punch me, kick me. I had marital rape as part of my story. I would have rather had any of those things than some of the things that came out of his mouth, because it just landed on this very tender heart that we're talking about, right? We're childhood trauma survivors. We have very tender hearts, and the fact that we're even alive and were alive at the time where we met our abusers is simply a miracle. The fact that we're not on the street with a needle in our arm, simply a miracle. And so listeners out there, please hear my friend Karen. If you're in a situation where you are being abused in any way, I want you to know that it is your strength that they probably see. Well, Karen, I'd like to move really quickly, not really quickly, I'd like to move into, we know that you left, obviously podcast listeners are hearing your voice, so clearly you got out. Did you go back, or did you only leave once, or did you go back?
Well, there was a time in our 29th anniversary, a year and a half before I left, that he tossed me out, and he got right with Jesus. And I thought I was supposed to go back. And so I did. Most of the time I didn't leave because I had nowhere to go. I was 1,500 miles from my family.
Right.
As I said, there were no shelters. We lived in a small community. There were no shelters.
And he was in the military. That's something to
Well,
really
he was
point out
out
here.
of the military
Okay.
at this time. And when our kids were somewhere around when I was 30, he went into law enforcement. And so he was either a city cop or a county cop. And so we were in that law enforcement environment. And so, call the police. He was the police, right?
Right.
And all of our friends were
Cops.
law enforcement.
Yeah.
And so shame kept me from telling anybody, because it was one of the things, don't you ruin my name. And I got to where I thought, but it's not me ruining your name. It's actually you doing that. But it got driven home. And I thought that because I made this choice, this was my life for the rest of my life, and that I had no way out. And I got to where I couldn't even imagine life being any different. And so, but God had, let me put it this way. There were so many times that I would ask God, I would come to him with my cries like David, just pouring out my heart. And he would say, trust me. And I always thought he was saying, trust me and stay. Just trust me through this. And scripture would back that up. I could name all the scriptures that backed up what I thought. And when I got out, the Lord said to me, I was saying, trust me and go, but you couldn't hear the go.
You couldn't hear the go.
And I was like, what? It's like he did not want me to stay in this. And I didn't know that I could have called my brother at any time and he would have come and rescued me out of this. But I didn't know those things because I was so isolated from my family. And when I did see him, I was so closed off. I was afraid of letting them know. I was shamed. So much shame is wrapped around that when they had their, perfect little families, and they had great families, great spouses. But I didn't have that. And how do you say that out loud? Because if you say it out loud, then you have to actually admit what you're in.
Yeah, that's a whole, we could talk for hours about that, about telling people. I didn't tell anybody until probably 3 or 4 months before I left, because I knew, back to that community, that people were going to step in, call the cops, everything. Just as a side note here, in all of my research and all of my interviews, that is a reoccurring theme. Law enforcement and military are the biggest, some of the biggest offenders of being abusers. And so let's move into, because we are on a season of forgiveness. And you have written a book that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But I would love you to tell us how you navigate forgiveness. What was the impotence of you making that transaction of forgiveness? You and I talked about what I call the scariest book verse in the Bible, and it's at least in Matthew. It's probably in all four Gospels, but in Matthew 6:15 says, "You must forgive, essentially, just as I've forgiven you." And so, tell us about your journey of forgiveness. It looks different for everybody. Personalities are different. We're gonna, talk about that all season, about how everybody's walk and everybody's decision and how everybody forgives is going to be different based on how we're made, and based on the trauma, and based on all kinds of things. And so, can you take about 3 to 5 minutes and tell us about your journey to forgiveness? Because there's somebody on the other end of this microphone, somebody with an earbud listening to us right now on 6 continents. We still can't get Antarctica. 6 continents and all over this country are listening to us, and they're holding on to nuggets because they want to forgive somebody who has deeply hurt them. There's domestic violence pain has to be top 10 pain, in my opinion. Can you take about 3 to 5 minutes and tell us about your journey to forgiveness?
When I came out, I kept going. I went to church, even though going to church was hard and I didn't know why. But I thought, like that, you have to forgive. And so at some point, I slapped on the band-aid of forgiveness. And what I didn't know was slapping of forgiveness on this gaping wound. And when I came out, I read all the books about what happened to me, but didn't know that I could actually heal. And so I buried all the pain, and I thought slapping forgiveness on that made it all go away.
Yeah.
And what it actually did is, because I thought I forgave, I didn't process my anger, which actually took a couple of years to process. I thought I was fine. I thought I was strong. I thought I was growing in the Lord and being a good Christian girl, because this is what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to forgive. And it took me 7 years before I got into a healing group. And the last chapter of this group that we were doing was on forgiveness. And it became very evident to me that I had not forgiven, that I had never processed the pain. Yes, I told my family, how do you explain evil to people who have never experienced true evil? That was hard. I had said all these things, but I never really processed the pain or grieved what was associated with it. And at some point at the end of this group, the final thing I did was set him down in my mind in a chair. And I just went through all the stuff and told him how I felt, even though he wasn't sitting there, because I didn't want him to have any more territory in my life. And what that was a beginning, because this one of the scriptures in Matthew, I'm going to just read this real quick. It says, if you refuse to forgive from your heart. And what I discovered is, talking about your pain and processing your pain isn't refusing to forgive. It's that you can't heal from your heart until you deal with what's in your heart. And so healing keeps happening. And so often I've heard, well, it's an act of your will, but it's not always an act of your will, because sometimes forgiveness will mask the pain that needs to be processed, because God wants us to heal way more than we even want to be healed, because the healing process is hard. It's beautiful, but it's hard. And until I could process that and acknowledge the pain that I was hurt, that there were things that I didn't get. I didn't get to be a wife. I didn't get to really be a mother. I didn't get to mother my children. I didn't get love. I didn't get protection. All of the things I got and all the things I didn't get. And so when I say forgiveness last week, it's because something that he gave me has cropped up in my body again. And now I have to go to a doctor to have this thing resolved. And it felt like the gift that kept on giving. And I was angry. I wanted him to walk in the room just so I could hurt him. I was so angry. Does it mean I didn't forgive him back here? Well, of course I did, but there's this new thing
New
that's
opportunity to
up.
forgive.
And finally I'm like, Lord, I don't want him. He doesn't get territory in my life. He doesn't get to control my thinking, my dreams, my memories. And I just release him to you. I didn't even use the word forgiveness. I release him to you. You do whatever you want with him, because he doesn't get any part of me anymore. But that's the hard part about forgiveness, is that we have to live with the consequences of what they did to us. And forgiveness says we won't hold it against them ever. What?
Right.
That's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard, but it's the greatest act of love that we can do with forgiveness. Now, for me, it's not for him because I don't love him. I have like no feelings for him at all. It's love for my God and myself, that I love myself enough that I don't give him space in my life and I can release him. But it's not a band-aid, because as Christians, we tend to slap band-aids on things.
Yeah.
And then we avoid dealing with the pain.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. I think that there are people out there, and by the way, we share that in common. I got the gift that he keeps on giving too. Affects my heart, and I get to see a cardiologist and all kinds of stuff all the time. And yeah, it's the time when I'm laying on the table and they're doing a cath lab or at the cath lab or something, and I have to forgive them again. And so, but you said something there that I think is really important for our listeners, regardless of what it is that you need to forgive. We as human beings are wired to avoid pain. And so lots of things in these situations are very common. Substance abuse to numb the pain, promiscuity. A lot of people, particularly domestic violence survivors, will go from one person to the next so that they don't have to process that pain. But guys, if we aren't willing to lay ourselves bare in front of the only one that understands our sufferings, probably the most quoted scripture on this podcast is Hebrews 4:15. We do not serve a high priest who is unfamiliar with our sufferings, because he himself experienced the ultimate abuse, and he had to forgive a world of people who had been born, who was born, and who would be born. And so, but yet he had to acknowledge his pain, just like you just said, right? Because before he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, he in the garden had asked 3 times for the cup to be passed from him. He didn't want the pain, right? And then on the cross he said, what did he say? He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then after that is when he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so what you just did for us was outline beautifully what Jesus did on the cross. He processed the pain of abandonment, the Father turning his back from him. He processed it. He asked for it to be taken from him. I don't know about you, but in my domestic violence marriage, in my Christian world, I was convinced he was going to get saved and all was going to be redeemed. And I'm not saying Jesus thought that on the cross. We know he was both fully man and fully God. But he did exactly what you just said. He understood that he felt abandoned and that he needed to deal with what was going on inside of him. And I might be stretching that a little bit, but in a way I'm not, because you did exactly what he did in that sequence of events. And so, guys, if you're out there in an attempt to forgive somebody, we've talked about domestic violence today here, and we're getting ready to talk about Karen's book briefly, but any pain that you are experiencing, lots of times the forgiveness flag, monster, whatever you want to call it, jumps up and down, and we rush to forgive because we are so we don't like pain, and so we slap that forgiveness Band-Aid on it and call it done, right? But it's not done because we've not dealt with the root of the problem, which is pain, which is shame, which is guilt, which is a bunch of things that don't belong to us. But at its core, it's rejection. It's hurt. It's like, why am I not valuable enough for somebody to decide to keep their hands off of me? Why am I not valuable enough for somebody to keep their vows and love me like he said he was going to love me? why. And so I love that journey to forgiveness, and the fact that we both acknowledge that this is something that we have to do all the time, even though we're 15 and almost 20 years respectively removed from this abuse. This is something that we still have to deal with. And so this is something that my listeners are going to be chewing on as we navigate forgiveness, guys. Acknowledge what's going on inside of you. Because if you don't think that you're worthy, then you're just going to slap forgiveness, give it away like you're giving away a carnival ticket, and call it a day. And yet you're still going to be suffering in those moments I call shower moments. And when you put your head on the pillow at night all by yourself, you're still going to be suffering. And so I love that. And you even pointed in there, you had to love yourself. And, a lot of Christians are like, you're not supposed to but the Bible says love your neighbor as yourself. And we are precious daughters of the Most High God. And so, of course, we are valuable. Of course, we are to see that value. Listeners, though, don't be surprised. And Karen, you can tell me whether you agree with this or not. Once you realize that value, people get put on shorter leashes, boundaries get pushed in, and for me, like when I began to realize my value, the pendulum swung way on the other side, and somebody could, step on my toe, and I would just, have to go through a whole process of forgiving them. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not really. I just want to give listeners a warning. Once you realize your value, the pendulum is going to swing, and you're going to realize quite a few people probably mistreat you, maybe not on purpose, but you'll land in the middle. And when you do, you'll know that you are forgiving whatever your impotence is for forgiving. My impotence was, I knew that it was scriptural. And then finally, I didn't like the way I was feeling. And to your point, I'm not giving him a seat at my table. I have made an entire ministry with his name. And these are Joel 2:25 moments, And so speaking of Joel 2:25 moments, as we close out the podcast here, Karen, you have a book. And let's talk about where they can find it and where they can find you.
This book, Hope for Healing from Domestic Abuse, and you can buy it pretty much anywhere. Amazon and Barnes and Noble and christianbooks.com and just anywhere. The publisher has put it out everywhere.
Okay, good.
Like I said. And this, it came out last August. And I actually wrote a little bit of my forgiveness out there. And I was like, wow, sometimes I'm amazed at what I wrote.
I don't know about you, but sometimes,
you do that, right?
Yeah, sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes as a writer, I sit down and just my fingers start moving and I read what happened at the end. I'm like, where did that come from? Yeah. And so listeners, I will put Karen's Linktree link in the show notes. And so right there, when you're in your app, you'll see the first one to be contact Amy. That is to contact me and for any reason that you want. Follow me on Instagram. That's where all the fun stuff happens. And then the second link you'll see will be contacting Karen, and in there you will be able to purchase the book. I'll put the Amazon link in there as well. Well, Karen, what you've done for us today is so amazing, and you're amazing, and you are another example of Joel 2:25. I always love to give my guests the last word, and so what I would love for you is if we both close our eyes and think about our avatar, think about our why, right? Think about the person, think about that person that we do what we do. You write and speak, and I write and speak and do a podcast and work in behavioral health. And when I close my eyes, I think of a certain person, and I have often, I have things I would say to that person. When you close your eyes and think about the domestic violence victims out there, I'm going to call them victims, the people that are still either actively in it or in bondage to it, what would you say to them?
This is not God's plan for your life. It's not marriage. God loves you more than he hates divorce. He loves you actually more than he loves marriage, because marriage is not abusive. That it's the opposite of that. And he loves you so much. His love for you is so extraordinary and so magnificent, and you can't get to the end of it. And again, this was never his plan for your life.
Right.
And so, so you can reach out. You don't have to do this alone. There are so many resources out there now that weren't available when I came out or when Amy came out. There's so much out there to help you in this process, because leaving is hard, and leaving is just the beginning.
Right. That's so true. And again, a whole nother podcast on that. Leaving is just the beginning, not to discourage you guys, but getting out of the situation. You said something there that I think is a fantastic way to end this discussion, is God loves you more than he hates divorce. And so let's pretend that there was no room in scripture for divorce with abuse, which there is, but let's pretend that there's not. He loves you more than he hates anything. He loves you more than anything. I love the song by Maverick City, Jireh. And the first verse of that song says, I wasn't holding you up, so there's nothing I can ever do to let you down. Jireh, you're more than enough. And he loves us so much, guys. He does not want us to suffer. And so as Phil Baker's song plays us out of the podcast, thank you, Karen, for being here today. Guys, reach out to either one of us. It is, again, Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And with that, I'd like to announce, for those of you who donate to the podcast, and you can do that by clicking that Contact Amy button. We have a fundraiser coming up, but we just awarded our 5th scholarship, and it was in the name of Cheryl Rice, who is in October of 2008. And as a matter of fact, October 14th of 2008, I was sitting in a psych ward after a complete nervous breakdown, after some death threats, after leaving my own husband. And Cheryl, my friend, is the one that drove me to the hospital, where I stayed for 5 days, and my healing began. Counseling is a huge resource, and besides Jesus himself, it is the reason why I'm sitting in front of you here today. So guys, our 5th scholarship, I was aiming for 4. This is the 5th one in the name of Cheryl, which will go to Baylight Counseling at Calvary Church in Clearwater, Florida. Karen, thank you for being here today. Listeners, we will be back here in 2 weeks with another story of forgiveness as we continue our series in forgiving trauma makers. Karen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me on, Amy. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much. And guys, go buy the book. Thank you so much for being here today. Listeners, we'll be back in 2 weeks, and I hope that you will remember that you are seen, known, heard, loved, and valued. See you guys in 2 weeks.
Let my life glorify you and teach me to walk beside you. And I want to be more like you, so let my life be one marked by you. Marked by you, marked by you.